Have you ever wondered? Could a single whisper, a fleeting glance, change the course of your entire life? Imagine one day you step out of your house, walking down the same street, seeing the same familiar faces, but suddenly, no one greets you anymore. They look away, they pull their children closer, and you have no idea what you did wrong. In small American West towns of the late 19th century, no proof was needed to convict someone. A cleverly worded question was all that was required. "She looks more tired than before, doesn't she? Her dress seems looser." A young widow, who knows? No one said it directly, but everyone understood what was being implied. And then you have to choose. Stay and be viewed with suspicion every day, or leave taking with you a tarnished reputation, even though you never did anything wrong. If it were you, what would you do when an entire community turns its back on you, when the church, which once taught compassion, is silent, and when the law only advises you to leave, to avoid trouble? This is not a story about guilt. This is a story about honor, and about a moment when one man stood up while everyone else chose to bow their heads. If you've ever lived in a small town, if you've ever witnessed good people being hurt by rumors, or if you've ever wondered, if only someone had stood up for me that day, stay with me. And before the story begins, if you feel something familiar in your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Because stories like this deserve to be told slowly and listened to the end. Millstone Creek is nestled among sprawling meadows, its shallow creek winding like an old war scar. After the Civil War, the town was like hundreds of others on the frontier, small, compact, hard-working, and self-righteous. The white wooden church at the end of the main street was not just a place of prayer, it was a moral center, a place where people looked at each other to gauge who was living properly and who was beginning to deviate from the accepted path. Every Sunday morning the church bells rang regularly, a sound that once held a sense of comfort, but it was also there that silent, judgmental glances were exchanged across the rows of wooden pews. In Millstone Creek, the truth is, you walk. The rumor is, you ride on horseback. In just one afternoon, a whispered remark at the grocery store, a meaningful shake of the head from someone deemed trustworthy, things can spread faster than the wind across the prairie. Men are judged by their work. Women, on the other hand, are judged by their reputation. A woman may work hard and live quietly, but if her reputation is tarnished, all her other efforts become meaningless. Millstone Creek prides itself on being a respectable town. But the price of that respectability is that there is no room for error. And if that error, even if only imagined, falls on a woman, the verdict is often decided before she even has a chance to speak. On the surface, the town looks peaceful. Children play on porches, smoke rises from cooking fires every afternoon, and people call each other by their names. But beneath the surface lies a network of unwritten norms, where the silence of the majority can be more weighty than any accusation. And it is in this seemingly peaceful setting that a woman is about to be pushed to the margins, not because she committed a crime, but because this town doesn't know how to forgive what it doesn't understand. Millstone Creek continued as usual. But from the moment the whispers began, it was no longer a refuge. It became a test. It's not about seeing who's right, but about seeing who dares to stand up when what's right is being suppressed. Clara Whitfield wasn't the type to turn heads. In Millstone Creek, where everything was small and familiar, she existed as part of the scene. Quiet, proper, neither superfluous nor lacking. She was often seen every morning walking along the dirt road leading to the elementary school. Her dark dress draped neatly, her collar buttoned, her light brown hair neatly tied back. No jewelry, no perfume, nothing that could be misinterpreted as an invitation. Clara wasn't trying to act that way. She was just used to living that way. In Millstone Creek, everyone knew Clara was a widow. Her husband had died when they were very young. A simple accident, like many deaths on the frontier. A horse panicked the reins, snapped a moment of carelessness, and it was all over. No great tragedy, no hero, just a void that appeared and remained. Clara did not remarry, not because she received no inquiries, but because she had never opened a door. After the funeral, she returned to school. She taught the children to read, do math, and write simple sentences about the world they were just beginning to understand. She did this every day, regularly, without complaint. People said she was strong, but the truth was, Clara had no other choice. In the evenings after the school had quieted down, Clara returned to her small wooden house on the edge of town. She cooked her own meals, mended her own clothes, fixed little things herself. No neighbors visited, no afternoon tea, no conversations that lasted longer than necessary. It wasn't because she was arrogant. It was because Clara understood very well that in Millstone Creek distance was a form of self-protection. She learned that early on. Even when she was married to a decent man who was often the subject of gossip because he wasn't wealthy. From the moment she realized that just one small mistake would be remembered by the whole town longer than any other good deed. Therefore, Clara lived cautiously. She didn't socialize. She didn't get close to anyone. She didn't give anyone a chance to misunderstand her. With her students, she was gentle but reserved. With parents, she was polite but not overly familiar. At church, she attended regularly, sat in the right place, and left at the right time. No one could say Clara did anything wrong, but neither could anyone truly say they understood her. There are women like that. They don't make a fuss. They don't demand anything. They don't step outside the boundaries set for them. They believe that if they live honestly, quietly, and uprightly enough, then life, or at least people, will leave them in peace. Older viewers, when looking at Clara Whitfield, will see a familiar image: women who have lived their lives by principles, who have taken on responsibility instead of demanding happiness, who have chosen silence instead of explanation. Clara didn't think she was brave. She just thought she was doing what needed to be done. But it was precisely this modesty that made her more fragile than anyone else. Because in Millstone Creek, one might forgive the noisy misdeeds of men, but a woman who lives too righteously when suspected will have nowhere to retreat. Clara understood that. Perhaps she understood it even better than others. That's why she always wears dark clothes, to avoid letting light fall on her. That's why she avoids lengthy conversations, where words can be distorted. That's why she doesn't allow herself to look tired or weak in public. She believed that if she didn't create any loopholes, the town wouldn't find a reason to hurt her. But Clara forgot one thing. In some places the loophole lies not in action, but in prolonged silence. And there are communities that when they can't find the error will create a question themselves. Clara continued her life as usual. Teaching, attending church, getting home before dark. Unbeknownst to her, while she walked cautiously somewhere in the town, eyes had begun to linger on her a little longer. Words had slowed, carrying a deeper meaning, and seemingly harmless questions had begun to be asked. No one came to tell Clara. No one warned her. Because in Millstone Creek, you don't confront things directly, you observe. And Clara Whitfield, a woman who had lived a righteous life, was completely unaware that her very righteousness was bringing her closer than ever to a storm she hadn't created, but would have to face herself. Like many tragedies in small towns, it didn't begin with a crime. It began with a very soft whisper. And when that whisper was uttered, none of them suspected that it would soon force a quiet man to stand up before the entire town and utter a sentence that could change the fate of all. Clara Whitfield still believed that if she just continued living as before, everything would eventually pass. But in Millstone Creek, stories never end on their own. They just wait for someone to start telling them differently. No lightning struck Millstone Creek on the day the rumors began. No major incident. No wrongdoing was caught red-handed. It was just an ordinary morning when Clara Whitfield entered the classroom earlier than usual, placed her old cloth bag on the desk, and sat quietly for a moment before calling her students in. She was a little tired that day, that's all. But in Millstone Creek, even the smallest thing is enough to make people start looking longer than necessary. Beatrice Crowe was the first to realize it, or at least the first to say it in a way that couldn't be refuted. Beatrice wasn't a bad person in an obvious way. She was the kind of person who was always there at the right time, knew which families were in trouble, and always spoke in just the right amount of caring so no one could find fault with her. That's why when Beatrice leaned her head in Harper's store and whispered, "I've noticed Clara looks more tired lately," no one objected. She didn't say something's wrong. She didn't say I have my suspicions. just a comment wrapped in perfectly appropriate concern. A few days later, on the church steps, Beatrice uttered another remark as light as a breeze. "She's wearing a looser dress than before, isn't she?" Then she laughed as if she herself found the question silly. But the question has already been asked. In Millstone Creek, you don't need proof to remember something. It just needs to be repeated enough times by enough people considered trustworthy. A young widow, lives alone, is not very sociable, always so secretive that no one knows what she's thinking. And then the words came out. It's unclear where they first came from. Maybe by the well, maybe after the ceremony. A young widow, who knows? No exclamation marks, no accusatory tone, just an ellipsis. It is precisely that gap that is the most dangerous. Clara didn't hear those words immediately, because they weren't saying them to her face. They were saying them behind her back in the same tone they used when discussing the weather or the harvest. But Clara sensed the change. One parent didn't linger to chat. Another mother quickened her pace when she saw her at the school gate. Eyes lingered on her for a moment longer, then looked away. Clara wondered if she had done things differently. She reviewed each day, each action. She still went to school on time. She still ate simply. She still wore her old dresses. She couldn't find anything wrong. And that made her even more uneasy. Because in Millstone Creek, when one cannot point out what is wrong, the very ambiguity becomes the verdict. Beatrice Crowe continues to do what she does best, not say too much. She only sighed at the right moments. She shook her head slightly when Clara was mentioned. And she always ended with a familiar phrase, "I just hope I'm wrong." That statement made others feel like they were hoping for the same thing. But the hope here wasn't about believing in Clara. It was about hoping that if something bad happened, at least it wouldn't be their fault. The whispers gradually created a thick, oppressive atmosphere. No one dared speak loudly. But everyone knew what was being implied, and that implication was most significant for a woman who had lived a life of caution. Clara began sleeping less, not because of physical exhaustion, but because her mind was restless. She stood in front of the mirror longer each morning, not to admire herself, but to check if there was anything on her body that was speaking for her. Little did she know that her silence, a safe haven for so many years, was now being interpreted as an admission of guilt. In Millstone Creek, it was customary for women to speak up to prove their innocence. And when a woman remained silent, that silence was quickly filled by others. The church did not intervene, because no one had officially accused anyone. There was nothing to object to. The police chief didn't know how to handle it either. There's no law against asking questions. And so a community that once prided itself on its morality is gradually becoming accustomed to being sidelined, while a woman's honor is eroded little by little. Clara still went to church. She still bowed her head in prayer. But she began to feel that the wooden pews were becoming unfamiliar. No one chased her away, but no one invited her to sit next to them either. That's how Millstone Creek hurts people. No violence needed, just distance. Beatrice Crowe never named sin. She didn't need to, because when a question is asked long enough, people will naturally fill in the answer in a way that makes them feel most comfortable. And in small towns like Millstone Creek, the easiest way to find peace of mind is to believe that someone else has done wrong so that you don't have to face the injustice yourself. Clara Whitfield didn't fully understand what was happening. But she knew one thing: the town no longer saw her the way it used to. And when a community begins to view you with suspicion, every action, no matter how proper, can be interpreted in the worst possible way. The seeds of tragedy don't explode. They take root silently, in unintentional remarks, in evasive glances, in silences considered polite. And Clara, the woman who believed she was safe because she lived righteously, is now at the center of a vortex she didn't create, but will soon be drawn into. Clara still hoped that if no one spoke out, things would eventually calm down. But in Millstone Creek, whispers never disappear on their own. They just wait until they're strong enough to transform into stares and actions. Violence in Millstone Creek doesn't come with fists. It comes with stares. Clara Whitfield realized this one early autumn morning just as the school bell rang for class. She stood on the steps as usual, waiting for her students to run to her with their dusty shoes and innocent laughter. But that morning the schoolyard was emptier than usual. It's not completely empty, it's just a few children are missing. Clara stood still, clutching her gradebook tightly. She didn't ask. Teachers at Millstone Creek weren't accustomed to asking things that might make someone uncomfortable. But a chilling sensation began to spread through her. Slowly, surely. In the days that followed, the number of empty desks in the classroom gradually increased. No one came to her to complain. Not a single letter. Not a formal explanation. The children who used to call her Miss Whitfield in their clear voices are no longer around. And when Clara happened to run into their parents on the street, those brief conversations became even shorter. "Hello, miss. Hello, ma'am." Then they turned away. No hostility, no anger, just distance. At Millstone Creek it was the clearest sign of judgment. Clara began to understand that the whisper had taken on a different form. It was no longer a question. It had become a collective decision. No one held a meeting. No one voted. But everyone acted as if they had agreed on it beforehand. A mother pulled her child closer as Clara walked past. A father looked straight ahead but didn't nod in greeting. Those once neutral gazes now held a thin layer of something. Not exactly anger, but a restrained contempt. Clara wasn't forbidden from entering the school. She still had the key. She still had the blackboard. She still had the chalk. But her classroom was no longer a classroom. It had become a large, echoing room where her voice reverberated within itself. She taught as if she had a full complement of students. She wrote each word on the blackboard. She read each paragraph aloud. It wasn't out of obligation. It was because she didn't know what else she could do. The situation at the church wasn't any better. Clara was still sitting in her usual seat, still bowing her head in prayer, still singing hymns in a soft, rhythmic voice. But no one was sitting next to her anymore. Left space, right space. No one told her to leave. No one invited her to sit somewhere else. The wooden benches simply moved, as if unintentionally, leaving her alone. The priest continued to preach about compassion, about tolerance, about not judging. But he didn't look in Clara's direction, and he didn't mention her either. The church's silence weighed more heavily than any accusation. Clara realized that in Millstone Creek, the silence of those in authority was tantamount to permission. Allow the contemptuous stares to continue. Allow parents to withdraw their children from the classroom. Allow a woman to be pushed to the sidelines without clear reason. Clara didn't cry. Not because she was stronger than others, but because tears were no longer of any use. That evening, upon returning to her small wooden house, she sat for a long time at the unadorned dining table. The oil lamp cast its light on the blank wall. There was no conversation, no one to explain or justify herself to. She began to wonder, should she speak up, but speaking out about what? About a sin that has never been named. Clara understood that if she defended herself too soon, people would say she had something to hide. If she remained silent for too long, people would take it as an admission. It's a trap of mob violence. It doesn't offer you an honorable escape. Over the following days, the school began discussing a temporary rearrangement of classes. No one spoke directly to Clara, but she heard phrases repeated over and over, for the children's benefit, until things are clearer, just a precautionary measure. Clara has not yet been convicted, but every decision is being made as if she were guilty. Beatrice Crow doesn't appear in person. She doesn't need to anymore. What she sowed has grown large enough to take shape on its own. A community once accustomed to suspicion will find ways to rationalize its own behavior. They told each other that they were only protecting their children, that they didn't hate Clara, that if she was truly innocent, then everything would eventually come to light. But while they waited for the truth, Clara was losing everything that made her belong here. Honor, work, and the right to exist without scrutiny. Mass violence leaves no bruises, but it leaves behind isolation, and that isolation leads people to begin to doubt themselves. Some mornings Clara would stand in front of the mirror searching her face for some sign that could explain what was happening. She couldn't find it, and that hurt more than finding a mistake. Millstone Creek continued to be a place of activity. Shops were open. Church bells rang. Children played in other yards. Life in the town didn't slow down. It just wasn't waiting for Clara anymore. And of all that, what hurt Clara the most wasn't being suspected, but the fact that no one stood up and said, "Wait." No one asked her if she was okay. No one asked if she needed help, because asking that would be tantamount to questioning the correctness of the majority opinion. In Millstone Creek, going against the crowd is always the hardest thing to do. Clara understood that when a community has decided to turn its back, the truth, even if it emerges, will come too late for those who have been hurt, and she began to feel herself being pushed to a point where silence was no longer a safe option. Clara Whitfield was not convicted by law or the church, but the entire town acted as if the sentence had already been pronounced, and when isolation becomes a threat, there will always be people advising you to leave for the sake of peace, even if you have never done anything wrong. The face-to-face meeting took place without prior notice. No invitation, no formal meeting. Just one morning, as Clara Whitfield locked the classroom door and stepped out of the school gate, she realized so many people were waiting for her. They stood in small groups: parents, a few church members, a familiar face from the grocery store. No one was angry. No one was shouting. But no one smiled. Clara stopped instinctively. She maintained her straight posture, her hands neatly placed in front of her, just like when she stood in front of class. Only her eyes were slightly wider than usual. A man stepped forward. He was the father of one of the students who had dropped out of class. "Miss Whitfield," he said, trying to keep his voice calm, "we think perhaps it's time you explained a few things." Explain. That word echoed through the morning air like a knife wrapped in cloth. Clara didn't answer immediately. She looked around. No one objected to the statement. No one said it was inappropriate. "What needs explaining, and to whom?" Another woman chimed in more gently. "We're not accusing you, it's just, everyone's talking about it. And you know here, reputation is very important. Reputation." That word was spoken with regret, as if Clara herself were the one hurting it. Clara felt her throat dry up, not from fear, but from the cold absurdity of that moment. She had never been asked for her opinion when they whispered, never been invited to participate in conversations about her. And now, when everything had been decided in silence, they turned to her and asked her to prove it. "We just want you to clarify," another person said, "so that things can be cleared up. Clean." Clara realized that from this moment on, her innocence was no longer a given. It had become something to be proven. She stood there in the middle of the school gate, a place once filled with the laughter of children now transformed into a judgeless courtroom. No one spoke loudly, no one pointed, but all eyes were on her. Clara thought back to the years she had lived in Millstone Creek. The mornings going to school early, the nights grading papers by the oil lamp, the times she had turned down social invitations to avoid gossip. All of those things, nobody mentioned them. Only the present moment exists. And one question remains unanswered. She took a deep breath. "If you want me to explain," Clara said slowly, "then please be clear. What do you want me to explain?" No one answered immediately, because when they have to name what they suspect, those people suddenly lack courage. Finally, a voice spoke from behind. "You know what people are talking about." That's Beatrice Crow's voice. She didn't step forward. There was no need to. Her presence, even just her voice, was enough to reassure everyone that they were on the right side. Clara turned to look. Beatrice wasn't looking directly at her. She was looking down at her gloves as if all of this had exhausted her. "We don't want to make a big deal out of it," Beatrice said, "but if you don't say anything, people will just keep speculating." That was the final blow. No accusations, no condemnations. Just a burden placed on Clara's shoulders. Either she says something to reassure them, or she accepts their continued suspicion. Clara felt a profound weariness. Not weariness from the rumors, but from having to defend a life that had always been upright. She realized that no answer would satisfy them. If she objects, they'll say she's being defensive. If she remains silent, they'll take it as admission. If she explains too much, they'll become even more suspicious. This is not a conversation. This is an exclusion ritual. Clara lifted her head. Her voice was not loud. It didn't tremble. "I have nothing to explain," she said, "and I have no obligation to prove my innocence to anyone." A very slight ripple spread. No anger, no outrage. It's just disappointing. The disappointment wasn't because Clara was guilty, but because she didn't follow the script they expected. One person shook their head, another sighed. "We only want what's best for the children," someone said. That statement was seen as the final word, because no one could object for the sake of the children. The gathering gradually dispersed. No one said goodbye to Clara. They left feeling they had done what needed to be done. Clara remained alone in front of the school gates, the place that had once been the center of her life. She didn't cry, but in that moment Clara understood perfectly from now on she was no longer a part of Millstone Creek. It wasn't because she was kicked out. It was because she had been pushed beyond the boundaries of trust. Older audiences, upon hearing this, will recognize something very familiar. In the old days, people didn't need social media to destroy each other. All it took was a small community, a few well-chosen questions, and a woman standing alone. That method isn't new, and the most painful thing is it still persists today. Clara Whitfield did not lose her honor that day. She lost the right to be considered innocent until proven otherwise, and that is the hardest loss to recover from. After that morning, Clara understood that she was no longer welcome in what she once called home, and that when a woman is publicly ostracized, the community's next step is often not to apologize, but to advise her to leave for the sake of peace and quiet. Sheriff Thomas Hale's office was located on the far corner of Main Street, across from the public stables. It was a low, dark brown wooden house, always smelling of leather, tobacco, and dust. It embodied the order of Millstone Creek. Simple, practical, and never seeking trouble. Clara Whitfield entered the church late one afternoon when the sun had turned a honey-colored hue. She hadn't been formally summoned. Just a message delivered through the church doorman. "The police chief wants to see you for a moment." No one said why. Thomas Hale sat behind a wide wooden desk, his police cap set aside. He was a man in his 50s, a veteran of war more accustomed to quelling conflicts than to judging right and wrong. When he saw Clara, he rose and pulled out a chair for her. A rare gesture of courtesy in that situation. "Miss Whitfield," he said, his voice low and weary, "I hope you understand. I did not call you here to accuse you." Clara nodded slightly. She was familiar with that opening line. Thomas Hale sighed, clasping his hands together. "There are no formal charges," he continued. "No complaint, no evidence." He paused for a moment. "But the situation in town isn't good." Clara sat up straight. She didn't ask, "How bad is it?" because she had been living with it for weeks. The police chief stood up and walked to the window to look out at the street. Several people were walking by, talking quietly to each other. He watched them for a moment, then turned back. "You know," he said, "Millstone Creek is a small place. Once people start talking, it's very hard to stop." Clara remained silent. "Some parents came to see me," he continued. "They didn't accuse her. They just said they were worried. Worry, another word used in place of judgment. And I have to think about the peace of the town." Thomas Hale continued, his voice slow as if he himself didn't quite believe what he was saying. "We don't want things to go any further." Clara looked up at him. "How much further?" Sir Thomas Hale didn't answer immediately. He turned back to the table, placing his hand on the worn wooden surface. "There are times," he said, "when people act on emotion. And when emotion overrides reason, the consequences are not easy to control." For the first time during the conversation, Clara felt a chill run down her spine. "Are you saying I'm in danger?" she asked, her voice still calm. Thomas Hale neither nodded nor denied it. He simply said, "I think it would be better for you if you left town for a while." The words were spoken softly, almost kindly. "It's only temporary," he added hastily. "Just to keep things quiet. Let's just leave it at that." Those 3 words fell into the middle of the room like an unsigned verdict. Clara didn't speak immediately. She looked around the office, guns hanging on the walls, old badges, jumbled papers. This was the place that represented justice, and justice at this moment was advising her to disappear. "What did I do wrong?" Clara asked, very softly. Thomas Hale bowed his head. "Nothing," he said, "and that's why. I can't defend you legally." That answer was a cold-cutting blow. The law does not side with the innocent. The law only intervenes when there is a crime to be committed. And when the crime goes unnamed, the victim is left to the hypocrisy of the majority. If I leave, Clara continued, what will people think? Thomas Hale sighed heavily. They'll think she's doing the right thing. Clara understood immediately. Leaving wasn't about proving her innocence, but about keeping the town from facing the consequences of her own mistake. If she leaves, Millstone Creek will be peaceful again. No more rumors, no more stares, no more awkward questions. The price was a woman's life. I've lived here for almost 10 years, Clara said, teaching their children to read, keeping to myself, not bothering anyone. Thomas Hale looked at her, a hint of regret in his eyes. I know, he said, but sometimes living right isn't enough. That's a sentence Clara will remember for a long time, because it speaks the stark truth of Millstone Creek. Morality is used for judgment, but not for protection. The conversation ended without signatures or minutes. Only advice was given considered for the common good. As Clara stood up to leave the office, Thomas Hale added, if you need time to sort things out, I'll give you a few days. A few days. As if she were preparing for a voluntary trip. Outside, the evening light had faded. The wind carried the scent of dry grass. Clara walked slowly along the familiar dirt path, each step feeling heavier than the last. She wasn't angry with Thomas Hale. He was simply the one who voiced what the whole town had been thinking for a long time. What hurt Clara the most wasn't the rumors nor the stares, but the moment the law turned its back on her in a polite manner. No rejection, no coercion, just advice expressed with genuine care. That's how hypocrisy lasts the longest. It doesn't force, it persuades. That night, Clara sat alone in the wooden house, the oil lamp burning dimly. She placed her hand on the table where she used to grade papers and write lesson plans. Everything was still there, but the feeling of belonging was gone. If she stays, she will remain isolated. If she leaves, she will carry with her a question that will never be answered. Neither option is fair. And in that moment, Clara realized Millstone Creek had pushed her to the brink without needing a single word of accusation. She doesn't know what she'll do. She doesn't know where she'll go. But she knew one thing. When even the law chose to stand aside, just one person, daring to stand up, could change everything. Clara Whitfield walked out of the police office with the advice to leave in hand, and just when the town thought the story would quietly end at the upcoming public meeting, a man of few words would stand up and say something nobody expected. The town meeting was held on a chilly, windy evening, as autumn had begun to drain its warmth from Millstone Creek. The old wooden hall was packed with people. The chairs were arranged close together, and whispers intertwined like an invisible net covering the room. No one said this meeting was for Clara Whitfield, but everyone knew why she was there. Clara sat in a seat near the back. She didn't choose that spot to hide, but because she had nowhere else to sit. The seats in front of her had been taken long ago, and no one had offered her a seat. She felt her hands growing cold. Not from fear, but from exhaustion. For weeks, Clara had been living in a state of semi-existence, navigating between stares, silences, and decisions made behind her back. Tonight's meeting was supposedly to resolve the situation in town, but Clara knew perfectly well this was the end of the silence. Sheriff Thomas Hale stood up first. He spoke about order, about peace, about Millstone Creek needing to uphold its values. He didn't mention Clara's name once, but every word was directed at her. Silent nods echoed throughout the room. Then Beatrice Crowe stood up. She didn't talk much, never needed to talk much. I think Beatrice said, her voice soft, as if sharing a common concern. We all want the truth to be revealed, not to punish anyone, but to protect the honor of this town. The town's honor, not Clara's honor. There are questions, she continued, that if left unanswered will continue to hurt us all. She turned slightly, her gaze sweeping over Clara for a very brief moment. No challenge, no pity, just acknowledgement that Clara was there, a subject that needed to be dealt with. Perhaps Beatrice, said Miss Whitfield, should say a few words. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Clara. At that moment, Clara felt like she was standing before a judge. No lawyer, no indictment, just a community waiting for her to defend herself. She stood up very slowly. No one helped her pull out a chair. No one avoided their gaze. Clara looked around. Familiar faces, parents, neighbors, fellow churchgoers. Now they looked at her as if waiting to see how she would break down. "I don't know," Clara said, her voice hoarse but clear, "what I need to say." A few murmurs arose. Beatrice tilted her head slightly as if regretting something. "We just wanted you to clarify," she said, "to put everyone's minds at ease." Reassured about what Clara wondered, that she deserved to be treated like this, she took a deep breath. "I've never done anything to be ashamed of," Clara said, "and I don't think I need to prove it to anyone." A very slight wave of discontent spread. No one booed. But the crowd's patience was wearing thin. Police Chief Thomas Hale cleared his throat. Perhaps he said we should remain calm, but nobody listened to him anymore. Clara felt her legs tremble, not from weakness but because she had been standing for too long carrying too much weight. She understood that unless something changed right now, her life in Millstone Creek would end here. And then there was the sound of a chair being dragged, not big, not noticeable, but it rang out at the moment the room was most tense. A man stood up from the seat next to him. Samuel Harlan. He wasn't a regular at town meetings. The owner of Harlan Ranch, lived a few miles from town, was taciturn and reserved. He was known for his punctuality, for his straightforward contracts requiring no signatures, and for not saying anything unless he was prepared to take responsibility. Samuel Harlan rose slowly. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his face was weathered by the elements. No one knew how long he had been sitting there. But when he stood up, the room seemed to automatically make way for him. He didn't look at Clara immediately. He looked straight ahead, where Beatrice Crowe was standing. It seems Samuel said, his voice low, and even everyone is waiting for an explanation. No one answered. He turned to Clara at that moment. Just a fleeting glance. No questioning, no pity. Just a very human affirmation, "I see you." Then he said that. "If Miss Whitfield is pregnant," Samuel Harlan said, "then the child is mine." No one moved. No one was breathing heavily. The entire hall fell into an absolute silence, the kind of silence that only occurs when something momentous has just been said, when all previous assumptions are erased in an instant. Beatrice Crowe stood frozen. Sheriff Thomas Hale opened his mouth, but couldn't say anything. Clara spun around. She didn't understand. She didn't have time to understand. Samuel Harlan offered no explanation. He didn't utter another word. He just stood there. And it was his silence that made those words more powerful than any speech. The balance of power in the room shifted instantly. The eyes that had once been on Clara now turned to Samuel, not with curiosity but with wariness. Because in that society, a man declaring his responsibility was no ordinary matter. Samuel Harlan did not apologize to the town. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not offer an excuse. He simply positioned himself in a way that forced all rumors to stop or change direction. And for the first time since the story began, Clara Whitfield is no longer alone. She didn't know what Samuel was doing. She didn't know why he said that. But she knew one thing: someone had stepped up at the right moment. Not to save her as a victim, but to stop an injustice that is spiraling out of control. The hall remained silent, and in that silence, Millstone Creek understood that from this moment on every word would have to be reconsidered. After that statement, Samuel Harlan offered no explanation, no relenting, and his unwavering silence would force the entire town to confront the honor, responsibility, and legal consequences of the slander. After Samuel Harlan's statement, the hall didn't erupt as many had expected. It froze. There were no shouts, no protests. No one rushed to stand up and ask questions. Because in western towns like Millstone Creek, when a man declares responsibility before a crowd, it's understood that it shouldn't be said casually. Samuel Harlan remained standing there. His arms were at his sides. His shoulders were straight. Not a single superfluous gesture. He no longer looked at Clara. Not because he was cold, but because he knew that if he looked at her now, his words might be misinterpreted as an emotional gesture. And Samuel Harlan didn't come here to talk about emotions. He looked directly at the crowd. There was no defiance in those eyes, only the calmness of someone accustomed to standing before strong winds. "No one here," Samuel said, his voice low and clear, "has the right to continue speculating about Miss Whitfield's honor." He paused, not to catch his breath, but to make sure every word was heard, "and no one," he continued, "can continue saying that without being held accountable." A few people shifted slightly in their seats. Not out of fear, but because for the first time the scales had tipped. Samuel didn't explain why he said that. He didn't mention any relationship. He didn't provide details to satisfy curiosity, because he understood that explaining was giving the crowd the power to judge, and he didn't do that. "Honor," Samuel continued, "is not something to be discussed in a large gathering." He looked toward Beatrice Crowe. She stood still. For the first time since it all began, Beatrice didn't smile. "Honor," Samuel said, "is something a person upholds by living righteously, and it is something others must respect, whether they understand it or not." No one objected, because objecting at this point would be tantamount to admitting that they had participated in the opposite. Samuel turned to Sheriff Thomas Hale. "I believe that the law in Millstone Creek," he said, "still considers defamation to be an act with consequences." Thomas Hale swallowed hard. He nodded very slightly. "We have such a law," he replied. Samuel didn't smile. He didn't need that validation for himself. He needed the crowd to hear it. "Then," Samuel said, turning to look at the entire hall, "from now on, anyone who continues to spread rumors about Miss Whitfield will no longer speak to a single woman." He paused. The room was so quiet you could hear the wind whistling through the cracks in the door. "They will talk to me." That statement wasn't meant as a threat. It was a declaration of responsibility. Samuel Harlan didn't say who he would sue. He didn't say he would use violence. He simply put himself in the position of being the one to face the consequences. And that, in old Western culture, was more powerful than any warning. Clara sat there, her hands resting on her knees, her whole body still trembling slightly. Not because of fear, but because of the sudden turn of events. She didn't know what Samuel Harlan was doing. She didn't know how far he intended to carry his load. But she knew one thing: from this moment on, all the gazes that had been fixed on her had gone away. They turned to Samuel, and that made the whole town question itself. It's easy to suspect a lone woman, but to confront a man with honor, land, and status, that's a different matter entirely. Beatrice Crowe cleared her throat softly. "Mr. Harlan," she said, trying to keep her voice calm, "no one here wants to cause harm. We just—" "You don't need to explain," Samuel interrupted very softly. "And I don't need to hear it either." He looked at her, not harshly, but long enough for her to understand that any words she uttered next would carry legal weight. Beatrice remained silent. It wasn't because she admitted she was wrong. It was because, for the first time, she was no longer in the safe haven behind harmless questions. Samuel Harlan turned to Clara at this moment. No one else was watching. The moment belonged to the two of them, but it wasn't private. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "you don't need to say anything more. Just that one sentence. But it carries the weight of liberation." Clara didn't nod. She didn't say thank you. She just sat up straighter. Being protected doesn't mean you have to bow your head. The meeting ended without a vote. There was no official statement. But everyone left the hall with a very clear, unspoken understanding. This story no longer belongs to the masses. Samuel Harlan didn't linger. He put on his hat and went outside first. No one stopped him to ask further questions. No one patted him on the shoulder in approval. In the world of men like Samuel, doing the right thing isn't about getting praise. Clara rose more slowly. She sensed new gazes. No longer contemptuous, but not yet sympathetic either. It's just a precaution. And sometimes caution is the first step toward justice. Outside, night had fallen. Samuel Harlan stopped on the steps of the assembly hall. He didn't turn to look at Clara. He didn't wait. He did his part. The rest is up to her to choose. As the crowd dispersed and power shifted, Samuel Harlan walked out of town in silence, and on the dark road leading back to the ranch, he would, for the first time, reveal the true reason why he could no longer remain silent, as he had for so many years. Samuel Harlan left the hall as night had completely fallen. The oil lamps cast faint, flickering light from the small windows behind him like dying embers. The town of Millstone Creek gradually fell silent, but it wasn't the silence of peace. It was a silence that still held the echoes of something that had just been torn apart. Samuel did not turn his head to look back. He walked slowly along the dirt road leading out of town, the sound of his shoes crunching on the dry gravel echoing steadily. A gentle breeze rustled through the grass along the roadside, carrying the scent of cold earth and withered leaves. This was a road he had walked countless times, but tonight it seemed longer than usual. Clara Whitfield walked a few steps behind him. She didn't know why she was following. Perhaps it was because there was no one else to go with. Perhaps it was because in the moment, Samuel stood up in the middle of the hall, an invisible thread had bound their destinies together, though neither of them was ready to name it. They walked in silence for quite a while. It's not that there's nothing to say. It's that there are too many things that can't be said right away. Samuel was the first to break the silence. "You don't need to come with me," he said, his voice low without turning his head. "You can go home." Clara stopped walking. "He could have chosen not to stand up tonight," she replied. "But he did." Samuel nodded slightly as if he had anticipated the answer. He continued walking and Clara followed him. The road out of Millstone Creek sloped gently. From here one could see the low rooftops receding into the distance, the scattered lights like falling stars. Samuel stopped at a bend in the road, where the long shadows of trees obscured the view of the town. "There are things," he said slowly, "that I didn't say there." Clara didn't rush. She was more used to listening than asking questions. Samuel took off his hat and held it in his hand. The dim moonlight shone on a face deeply marked by sun, wind, and the passage of time. It wasn't the face of someone who often showed emotion, but tonight something was different. "Once upon a time," Samuel began, "I had a younger sister." Clara looked at him. She wasn't surprised. Men like Samuel often carried stories that would never be told in public. "She's 6 years younger than me," he continued. "Her name is Margaret." He paused for a moment as if to make sure the name remained intact when spoken. "Margaret is like you," Samuel said. "Not in appearance, but in her way of life." Clara didn't interrupt. "He lived quietly," he said. "Always kept to himself. Didn't give anyone a chance to misunderstand him. I used to think that was enough to keep him safe." Samuel chuckled very softly. There was no joy in it. "The town where we live," he continued, "is like Millstone Creek. Small, moral, and full of cleverly posed questions." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. "At first," Samuel said, "it was just whispers. I heard them. But I thought, if I didn't pay attention, it would all be over." He clutched the hat tightly in his hand. "I was wrong." Samuel recounted the story in a steady voice, neither high nor low, like someone reciting a memory they had memorized long ago. Margaret began to be looked at differently. The stares, the silences when she entered the room. Samuel saw it, but he remained silent. "That day," he said, "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought not getting involved was the way to protect it." His voice softened. "But silence is never neutrality." The rumors grew louder. No one accused anyone. They only asked questions. "Has anyone seen him with anyone? He seems different lately." "A young girl." "Who knows?" Samuel heard it all. "And he didn't stand up. By the time I realized it, he said it was too late." Margaret couldn't stand the stares. She couldn't stand the isolation. She couldn't stand having to prove that she hadn't lost anything. One morning, Samuel said, "I found it in the stable." He didn't elaborate. Clara didn't need to hear any more. "They say it was an accident," Samuel continued. "But I know. He was forced into a corner with no other option." Samuel remained silent for a long time. The wind blew harder, bending the grass by the roadside before springing it back up. "I've lived with it," he said finally. "Every day." Clara felt her eyes sting, but she didn't cry. She understood that tears weren't needed at this moment. "I couldn't save my sister," Samuel said, "and I let that town go on living as if they did nothing wrong." He turned to look at Clara for the first time since the story began. "Tonight," he said, "I'm not getting up for you." Clara felt no hurt. On the contrary, she saw a rare honesty. "I stand up," Samuel continued, "because I cannot remain silent any longer." Those words echoed in the night, heavy, yet also relieving, like a final door being opened. Clara looked at him for a long time. "He doesn't owe me that," she said softly. Samuel nodded. "I know." They stood there on the dark road between two worlds. Behind them a town that had just lost its right to judge, in front of them a future without a clear direction. Clara realized something she had never considered before. Samuel's actions weren't an external act of salvation. They were an apology to the past. And in the process of atonement, another person was protected. Samuel put his hat back on. "You don't need to feel indebted," he said. "I did this for myself." Clara nodded. And in that moment, for the first time since it all began, she no longer felt like a burden. They continued walking side by side, neither leading the other. The road leading to Harlan Ranch stretched out before them, bathed in the pale moonlight. No promises, no empty comfort. Only two people hurt in different ways understood that silence, sometimes, is the greatest sin. As Millstone Creek faded into the distance and the old story was told in the darkness of the night, Samuel Harlan brought Clara Whitfield back to Harlan Ranch. Not to escape, but to publicly stand by her in a choice that would open the next chapter in both their lives. Harlan Ranch emerged in the early morning light as a land accustomed to silence. Wooden hedges stretched along the hillside, the dry grass, a honey-colored hue, and the wind blew steadily, unhurried, unquestioning. It wasn't a place to hide. It was a place to stand firm. Samuel Harlan stopped his horse in front of the main log cabin, dismounted first, and then turned to Clara. He didn't offer a hand to help her down. Not out of coldness, but because he knew Clara Whitfield didn't need anyone to pull her down from her horse. She stepped down slowly. Her shoes touched the ground. A strange feeling ran through her. Not relief, but the sensation of setting foot in a place that required no explanation. Samuel pointed toward the house. "Here," he said, his voice low, "and even you don't need to hide from anyone." Clara didn't answer immediately. She looked around. The farm wasn't grand in an ostentatious way, but everything was solid. The horse stables were neatly built. The granary was tidy. There were no signs of makeshift construction. This was a place to stay, not just to visit. "Aren't you afraid?" Clara asked softly. "What will they say?" Samuel Harlan shrugged slightly. "They'll talk," he replied. "But they'll talk about me." That statement isn't meant to be a challenge. It's a long-accepted truth. Clara understood the most important thing. Samuel hadn't brought her here to hide her. He had brought her here to place himself between her and the world. In the days that followed, Harlan Ranch remained open. No strangers were barred. The rhythm of life didn't change. The workers still came, still greeted Clara with an initial scrutinizing glance, then with silent respect. Samuel gave no orders. He simply lived as usual. And that is the strongest statement of all. Clara wasn't hidden away in a back room. She ate at the table. She walked around the ranch grounds. She sat on the porch in the afternoons, reading or just watching the grass sway in the wind. Samuel wasn't with her all the time. He didn't constantly monitor her. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. Because protection in his world does not mean control. One afternoon, as the sunlight streamed across the valley, Clara stood gazing toward Millstone Creek, where the rooftops were now just faint dots in the distance. "I don't think," she said slowly, "I'll be back there any time soon." Samuel didn't look after her. "You don't have to turn back," he said, "unless you want to." Clara nodded. She realized that for the first time in a long time, a man was giving her a choice, not arranging her destiny. The days at Harlan Ranch passed slowly. There were no major events, no climaxes. It's about small things, but they hold true. In the morning, Clara woke up earlier than usual. She helped a cook prepare a meal. No one asked why she did it. No one told her to. At midday, she strolled around the grounds, memorizing every path, every row of trees. In the afternoon, she read for herself. Not to teach, not to prove anything. Samuel observed everything from a distance. He didn't interfere. He didn't give instructions. Because he understood very well that those who had been deprived of their self-determination once needed space to reclaim it. One evening, when the wind was stronger than usual, Clara sat at the dining table with Samuel. The oil lamp in the middle of the table burned steadily without flickering. "He brought me here," Clara said, "and didn't ask how long I would be staying." Samuel put down his spoon. Because he replied, "Time is not my decision." That remark left Clara silent for a long time. At Millstone Creek it was decided for her when she should leave. Here no one decides when she should stay. That difference, as gentle as a breeze, is enough to bring tears to one's eyes in silence. Clara began to realize leaving town wasn't a failure. It was a tactical retreat. To preserve her dignity, to avoid being crushed by things beyond dialogue. Samuel Harlan didn't call it fleeing, and he wouldn't allow anyone else to call it that. One morning a mailman from Millstone Creek stopped by the ranch. He delivered an envelope with no sender's name written on it. Samuel took it, opened it, read it quickly, and then folded it back up. "They're saying," he said, showing Clara the letter, "that I've taken you away." Clara looked at him, waiting for his reaction. Samuel simply said, "I don't need to correct them." "Why?" Clara asked. "For the sake of truth," he replied. "There's no need to chase rumors." Clara smiled very faintly. It was the first time in weeks. She understood that by remaining inactive at Harlan Ranch, Samuel was forcing Millstone Creek to confront itself. There was no lawsuit. There was no statement. There is only one firm presence that says she is here, and I stand with her. And sometimes that's all it takes to shake up a community that's accustomed to pushing others aside. Clara didn't know what the future held. She didn't know how long she would be in the ranch. She didn't know what would become of her relationship with Samuel. But she knew one thing for sure here: she wasn't defined by rumors, wasn't required to prove anything, and wasn't pushed aside just to keep the peace. Harlan Ranch is not a refuge, it is a living statement. And in the quiet of the valley, Clara Whitfield began to understand that sometimes, to continue living right, one needs to distance oneself from places that only accept one's own sense of right. As her days at Harlan Ranch gradually brought stability, Clara Whitfield began to confront a different fear. Not the fear of rumors, but the fear of being indebted, possessed, and losing herself, which would lead her to a choice even more difficult than leaving town. Nights at Harlan Ranch are quiet in a way very different from Millstone Creek. There are no tense silences where one waits for something to happen. Only the gentle breeze across the prairie, the soft creaking of wood as the temperature drops, and a sky so vast it makes one feel as if they are shrinking in their own thoughts. Clara Whitfield lay awake in the small east room of the main house. The room was meticulously prepared, neat and tidy, without any unnecessary clutter. Samuel Harlan had instructed the servants to arrange it as if it were her permanent residence, but no one had said so. It was that silence that began to make Clara uneasy. At Millstone Creek she was used to a judgmental silence. Here the silence was respectful, and that was what left her unsure of her place. Clara sat up and put on a thin sweater. On the small table beside her bed was a book she had brought from town. She had tried to read it for several nights in a row, but each time she could only turn a few pages before stopping. Because in her mind there was a question that kept repeating slowly but persistently. What am I doing here? Not a guest, not a family member either, and certainly not a fugitive, although many out there would call them that. Samuel Harlan never said she owed him anything. He never mentioned the town meeting or the statement that had turned everything around. He acted as if everything that happened was natural, something that had to be done. But that's precisely why Clara found it even harder to breathe. She lived her whole life based on independence. Even as a wife, she kept her responsibilities. Even as a widow, she didn't allow herself to become a burden to anyone. In Millstone Creek, that independence used to be a shield. In Harlan Ranch, it began to resemble something fragile. Clara stood up and opened the window. Cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of dry grass and damp earth. In the distance, the lights from the stables still flickered. Samuel was probably working late as usual. He didn't ask if she needed anything. He didn't come to check if she was settling into her new place. He didn't make any promises. And it was this lack of demands that began to scare Clara. She was afraid of being indebted to someone. This isn't the fear of a selfish person, but the fear of those who have lived too long by the principle, I only receive if I can give back. Samuel gave her shelter. He stood up against the entire town. He put his honor before hers. And Clara didn't know if she would ever be able to repay those things. She feared that one day gratitude would turn into obligation, and obligation would turn into constraint. That fear isn't loud. It lies deep within. So deep that many people only realize it when it's too late. Clara also feared being possessed. It wasn't because Samuel had done anything to arouse her suspicion. On the contrary, it was precisely because he had never done so. In Millstone Creek, men typically acquire property by talking about it, by making promises, by claiming ownership. Samuel Harlan didn't do that. He left everything open. And in that space, Clara began to wonder, was she slowly entering a relationship she had no control over? No one told her to stay, no one told her to leave. And it was that very freedom that frightened her more than a clear command. Because if there's an order, she'll know what she's protesting against. But when given the power of choice, people must also face their own responsibilities. Clara recalled the women she had seen in her life, women who had accepted help and then gradually lost their voices. No one took it away from them brutally. They gave it away themselves, little by little, in exchange for safety. Clara doesn't want to become that kind of person. She doesn't want protection if the price she pays is losing herself. And then the third fear emerged, silent, but the most intense. She was afraid of losing her identity. In Millstone Creek, she was Miss Whitfield, the teacher. That identity had been tainted, but at least it was hers. What was she at Harlan Ranch? Was she the woman Samuel Harlan was protecting, the target of a rumor that had already been dispelled, or simply part of his redemption story? Clara didn't want to become an icon. She didn't want to be the woman who was saved. She wants to continue being herself, a person with a career, a voice, and the power to make decisions. One morning as Clara was folding her blankets, Samuel knocked softly on the door. He stood in the doorway, not entering. "I need to tell you something," he said. Clara turned around, her heart tightening slightly. She was waiting for a request, a condition, an arrangement. The school administrator in the next town, Samuel said, asked if she wanted to continue teaching. Clara froze. "You told them," Samuel shook his head. "I'm just delivering a message." She looked at him for a long time. "Don't you think," she asked, "that I should stay here?" "Where it's safer," Samuel replied immediately without hesitation. "No one is at peace if they have to give up their true selves." That remark made Clara turn away quickly, not because she disagreed, but because it struck at her deepest fear. Samuel didn't stay long. After he finished speaking, he left. "Don't pressure them. Don't wait for an answer." Clara sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped together. She realized that Samuel didn't want to keep her by protecting her. But that very fact made the upcoming decision infinitely more difficult, because if she stays, that will be her choice. No one forced them, no one held them back. And if she leaves, she will have to accept that she has left a safe place in order to preserve something intangible called ego. Older audiences, upon hearing this, will understand perfectly. They have faced similar crossroads before. Between safety and freedom, between gratitude and independence, between being protected and being themselves. There are no perfect choices, only choices that are true to yourself. That night, Clara Whitfield couldn't sleep. She sat by the window until dawn, and as the first light of day streamed across the valley, she knew that the tranquility of Harlan Ranch had given her the most important thing, not answers, but the courage to ask questions. It is from this internal conflict that Clara Whitfield will arrive at a decision not based on emotion, not based on promises, but based on responsibility and reality. A decision called marriage, but one that did not begin with love. That afternoon arrived very slowly. The sun hung low over the southern valley of Harlan Ranch, its slanted light illuminating the dry grass and wooden fence. There was no sign that this would be any different. No anticipation, no preparation. Clara Whitfield sat on the porch steps, a book resting on her lap, its pages unturned in a long time. A gentle breeze blew, carrying the scent of earth and dry grass. It was the scent of persistence, not fragrant, not sweet, but familiar and real. Samuel Harlan emerged from behind her slowly. He wasn't wearing a hat. That was unusual. But Clara didn't turn around immediately. She had learned that at Harlan Ranch, no one stood behind you to surprise you. Samuel stood beside the wooden railing, looking out at the valley. For a long time, neither of them spoke. That silence wasn't heavy, but it carried weight. "Have you thought," Samuel said, his voice low, "and even about what you'll do next?" Clara nodded slightly. "I've thought about it," she replied, "but I don't have a complete answer yet." Samuel didn't ask her to say more. He simply nodded as if that were what he had anticipated. "There's something," he said, "I need to tell you, and I want to make that clear from the start." Clara turned to look at him. Samuel didn't look at her when he began. He gazed straight out towards the valley where the sunlight was receding from the grassy slopes. "I didn't say this," he said slowly, "because of feelings." Clara wasn't startled. She had prepared herself for it. "I didn't say either," he continued, "because of social obligation or because I wanted to reassure anyone." He paused for a moment. "And certainly not because I thought she needed to be saved." That statement made Clara let out a very soft sigh, as if something had finally come to rest. Samuel turned to look at her at that moment. His gaze was neither questioning nor pleading, just being frank. "I want to propose marriage," he said. "Not because of love, but because this is the only way I know to protect you in the long term." No background music, no climax. Only the wind blew across the porch, and a single sentence was laid down like a stone, neither rolling nor shaking. Clara didn't answer immediately. She gazed at Samuel for a long time, as if reading a legal document written in life, not in ink. "What are you talking about?" she asked. "Protecting me from what?" Samuel replied without hesitation. "No more being sent away again," he continued without waiting for a response. "The town will be quiet for a while, but then they'll find another way. They always do. A woman living alone, no matter how proper she is, never has peace for long." Clara bowed her head. "As my wife," Samuel said, "she will no longer be an object of gossip, not because she has changed, but because her place in society has changed." He said it without any embarrassment, because that's the truth of this era. "Marriage," Samuel continued, "is not a promise of happiness. It is a shield." Clara remained silent. Inside her, all the fears of the past few days resurfaced simultaneously. Fear of being indebted, fear of being possessed, fear of losing identity. But alongside those fears there's something else, something very real, very mature. If she refuses, everything Samuel said will be true. No one in Millstone Creek will step forward again. Not because they can't, but because they don't want to. Samuel Harlan didn't propose, like in romantic stories. He presented a life structure, and Clara understood that this required just as much courage as love. "He didn't say," Clara said, her voice very calm about his feelings. Samuel nodded. "Because I don't want her to agree based on emotions." He looked at her very directly. "If you agree," he said, "I want that because you find it fair, reasonable, and it doesn't make you feel inferior." That statement made Clara close her eyes for a moment. Many men can say, "I love you." But very few men dare to say, "I don't promise to love you. I promise not to make you lose yourself." Clara took a deep breath. "And what if I say no?" she asked. Samuel didn't hesitate. "I'll still stand by you," he replied. "But I won't pretend that for long enough. No threats, no coercion. It's simply the truth being laid bare." Clara stood up and took a few steps on the porch. She looked out at the valley where the last rays of day were fading. She thought of Millstone Creek. She thought of the school gate. She thought of the little log cabin that had once been her everything. And she thought of Harlan Ranch, where she wouldn't be asked why she was there and wouldn't be asked to stay. Clara turned around. "If I agree," she said slowly, "this won't be a marriage where I disappear." Samuel nodded. "I don't need a woman to disappear." She looked straight at him. "I wouldn't trade my career. I wouldn't trade my independence. And I need the right to leave, if one day I find myself no longer being myself." Samuel listened very carefully. He didn't interrupt. When he asked, "Whenever I need to," Clara replied. Samuel nodded again. Then he said, "We're talking about the same thing. There was no ring. There were no promises of eternal love. Only two people stand before a life or death agreement, an agreement not based on dreams but on mutual respect." Clara didn't say yes right then, and Samuel didn't wait. They stood side by side watching the sunset. Marriage in that moment was no longer the end of freedom. Rather, it was a form of protection so that freedom could continue to exist. After that unpretentious proposal, Clara Whitfield understood that if she entered into this marriage, it would be a conditional choice, and those conditions would force Samuel Harlan to prove his words, with concrete actions, not just promises. Clara Whitfield did not give an answer that afternoon. It wasn't because she hesitated in the way of a weak person. Rather, it was because she understood very well that a decision made too quickly often has a long-lasting price to pay. 2 days later, as the sky turned a light gray, Clara knocked on the living room door of the main house at Harlan Ranch. Samuel Harlan was sitting at his desk reviewing the ranch books. He looked up at the knock, seemingly unsurprised. "Come in," he said. Clara walked in, closing the door behind her. She hadn't brought any paper or pen. No preparation was needed. What she was about to say had been considered for many long nights. "I've been thinking," Clara said, standing upright, her voice steady. "If we're going to talk about marriage, then I need to make my conditions clear." Samuel set the books aside. He showed no signs of defensiveness, no sign of displeasure. "Go ahead and speak," he replied. Clara took a deep breath, not to gather courage, but to ensure that each word spoken did not go beyond what was necessary. "The first condition," she said, "is that I will continue teaching." Samuel didn't react immediately. He just nodded slightly, signaling her to continue. "I'm not saying this for the money," Clara said. "It's because it's a part of who I can't leave behind." She looked straight at him. "I couldn't become someone's wife if it meant I would no longer be Miss Whitfield the teacher." Samuel listened very carefully. "At Millstone Creek," Clara continued, "my profession was used as a judgment, then taken away for no reason. I'm not going into a marriage where my profession becomes the deciding factor." Samuel nodded. "That," he said, "doesn't bother me at all." Clara didn't smile. She wasn't finished speaking. "My second condition," she continued, "is that I need to be financially independent." This time Samuel leaned slightly forward, not out of protest but because he understood this was the most important thing. "I'm not going to live off your money," Clara said. "I can contribute to the common good, but I need my own share." She paused for a moment. "Not to protect him," she added, "but to protect myself, in case I start forgetting who I am." Samuel looked at her for a long time. "Do you want a separate account?" he asked, his voice neutral. "Yes," Clara replied, "and the right to manage it." Samuel nodded again. "That," he said, "makes sense." Clara felt a strange sensation in her chest. Not relief, but the feeling of being recognized as an equal adult. "My final condition," she said more slowly, "is that I need the right to leave." The room was silent. Samuel didn't interrupt, but Clara knew this was the most difficult condition. "I didn't say leave in anger," she explained. "Not leave to hurt." She placed both hands on the back of the chair, keeping her voice steady. "I'm talking about the right to leave, if one day I realize I'm living a life that's no longer my own." Clara looked directly at Samuel. "I need to know that if that happens, I will not be held back by obligation, by his honor, or by anyone's pity." Samuel remained silent for a long time. It wasn't because he was considering his own interests. Rather, he understood that this was no longer a simple marriage proposal. This was a two-way moral commitment. Finally he said, "If you stay," Samuel said slowly, "it will be because you choose to stay." He looked up at Clara. "And if she leaves," he continued, "that will also be because she chooses to." Clara didn't ask him if it would hurt if that happened, because that question wouldn't be fair. She just nodded. Samuel rose and walked to the window. The wind outside stirred the curtains gently. He looked out at the valley, then turned back. "There's one thing," he said, "I want you to understand clearly." Clara waited. "I don't agree to these conditions," Samuel said, "because I'm in a weak position." He looked straight at her. "I agree," he continued, "because I respect you." That statement wasn't grand, but it carried enough weight to endure for many years. Clara felt a lump in her throat. Not from overwhelming emotion, but from something very rare to be respected without having to fight for it. In this day and age, a woman setting conditions is often seen as demanding, pragmatic, or exploitative. But Clara Whitfield didn't exploit anyone. She simply refused to become a bargaining chip. Samuel Harlan understood that. So he said, turning back to the table, "We need to clarify everything in writing." Clara nodded. "No frills, no romanticism, It's just that these two people understand that a marriage can only heal if it doesn't begin with one-sided sacrifice. Clara left the living room in silence. She walked slowly down the wooden hallway, listening to the soft sound of her footsteps. She didn't know where this marriage was headed. She didn't know if feelings would develop between them. But she knew one thing for sure: if she went in there, she would go in as a full human being. And for older viewers, this is a moment that elicits silent nods of agreement, because they understand that the strongest woman is not the one who doesn't need anyone, but the one who knows what she needs, and dares to say it. The conditions were not intended to test Samuel Harlan verbally, but to force him to prove himself through action. And it was from this point that all commitments would begin to be fulfilled, quietly, but irreversibly. Samuel Harlan did not tell Clara that he agreed to her terms. He did it. 3 days after their conversation in the drawing room, while the morning mist still covered the valley, Samuel asked Clara to ride with him to the nearby town. Not Millstone Creek, another town, one without old memories and without scrutinizing glances. Clara didn't ask where they were going, because she understood men like Samuel, once they've made a decision, won't tell you beforehand. They stopped in front of a small red brick law office. Samuel dismounted first, holding the door for Clara. No formality, no ceremony. The lawyer was an elderly man with gray hair who spoke slowly. He glanced over the draft document Samuel handed him, then looked up. "Are you sure?" he asked. Samuel nodded. "Absolutely. That's a prenuptial agreement." It wasn't to protect Samuel's property, it was to protect Clara's freedom. The document clearly states, Clara Whitfield retains full rights to her income from teaching. All personal assets acquired before marriage remain the property of each individual. Clara has the right to leave at any time, without needing a legal reason, and without any financial constraints. Samuel signed without hesitation. He didn't ask any questions. He didn't change a single word. Clara sat opposite, her hands resting on her lap. She wasn't emotional in the way one might expect. No tears. No trembling. She felt something very strange, being respected without having to argue. Samuel said nothing as he left the lawyer's office. Neither did Clara. But on the way back to the ranch, the wind blew less intensely, and the distance between the two horses seemed to narrow. Not out of obligation, but because trust had just been placed in the right place. The second thing Samuel didn't happen in a single day. It happened little by little. Samuel began having people clear the land east of Harlan Ranch, a flat piece of land near a small creek far enough from the main house so that family life and work wouldn't get mixed up. Clara observed from a distance. She didn't ask. She didn't guess. Until one afternoon Samuel took her there. "I want to build a school," he said. "A small one." Clara was stunned. "Here?" she asked. Samuel nodded. "Here. Not to make a fuss. Not to prove anything to Millstone Creek. To put it simply, Clara's profession is not something that is allowed. It is a part of communal life." Samuel didn't tell Clara to teach there. He just built it. A classroom, a few wooden desks, a blackboard. The children from the nearby farms started coming. Not many, but enough. Clara stood in the room, still smelling of new wood, her hand touching the blackboard. She said nothing, but her eyes welled up slightly, not because of favoritism, but because of being able to remain true to oneself. The third task Samuel performed was the most arduous. He returned to Millstone Creek. This isn't for arguing. This isn't for demanding an apology, but to set boundaries. Samuel met with Sheriff Thomas Hale first. The conversation was brief, not heated. "I've hired a lawyer," Samuel said, "and I want everything to be clear." Thomas Hale sighed. "Where are you going?" he asked. "Go where it's needed," Samuel replied. Samuel didn't sue the whole town. He only targeted Beatrice Crow, not out of hatred, but because the truth needs to be called by its proper name. The lawyer sent a formal document stating defamation damage to reputation, resulting in job loss and emotional distress. Beatrice Crow did not appear in court immediately. She never imagined that her harmless questions could lead to legal consequences. But this time no one stood up to protect her. Millstone Creek remained silent, not because they were defending Clara, but because they feared setting a precedent. Samuel Harlan did not appear before the crowd. He did not utter any threats. He simply let the law do its job, something Millstone Creek had shied away from for far too long. Clara didn't participate. Samuel didn't ask her to either. "This is my job," he said. "It's not your responsibility." And Clara understood he wasn't protecting her in name only. He was protecting her out of personal responsibility. 3 actions, none of them noisy, none of them romantic. But for older audiences, this is where the reward lies. Because they've lived long enough to know, promises are easy, but actions, especially those that cause inconvenience, are what truly reveal a person's character. Samuel Harlan didn't change Clara. He didn't ask her to change. He was simply paving the way for her to continue being herself in a world that had once tried to push her out. And that's what makes their relationship based not on debt or sacrifice, but on equal respect. One evening, Clara stood outside the small schoolhouse in the ranch watching the children leave. Samuel stood at a distance leaning against the fence. He didn't approach. He didn't intervene. She turned to look at him. Samuel nodded very slightly. No words needed. Trust has been built, not by emotion but by a consistent series of actions. And when all commitments had been proven by action, Clara Whitfield understood that what mattered most was not how she had been protected, but which side of her own life she had chosen to stand on. A choice that would close this story in profound silence without the need for vows. The first morning of the new school year arrived very early. Dew still clung to the grass when Clara Whitfield opened the door to her small classroom at Harlan Ranch. The room was silent, the scent of new wood still lingering, the blackboard having been wiped clean the night before. The soft morning light streamed through the window, unhurried, undemanding. Clara stood in the doorway for a long time. It wasn't because she was nervous, it was because she realized she was in the right place. The children from the nearby farms began to appear. Their shoes were still muddy, their coats were too big for them. They looked around cautiously, then looked at Clara. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm. "No introductions needed, no explanations required. She is not the woman who was rumored to be involved, not Samuel Harlan's wife. She is Miss Whitfield, a teacher." Clara stood before the blackboard, chalk in hand. The first words she wrote weren't a lesson, just her name, Clara Whitfield. She turned around and looked at the children. "Let's begin," she said. Outside, Samuel Harlan stood leaning against the wooden fence, far enough away from the classroom so as not to disturb anyone. He didn't approach. He didn't stand at the door. He didn't look inside. He understood perfectly well this was Clara's space. Samuel never told anyone that he was proud. Men like him rarely say that. But the way he stood there, quietly, without interfering, was the clearest confirmation. Life at Harlan Ranch didn't change much after that. There was no lavish wedding, no event for the whole region to gather around and talk about. The relationship between Clara and Samuel wasn't described with flowery words. They ate at the same table, shared space, respected each other's schedules. They didn't promise to love each other forever. They didn't promise never to hurt each other. They did only one thing. They didn't side with the crowd when the crowd was wrong. Some afternoons Clara would sit on the porch, correcting her students' homework. Samuel would walk by, nod in greeting. No unnecessary questions, no curiosity. Some evenings they ate in silence. Not because they were distant, but because there was no need to fill the gap with words. Clara did not return to Millstone Creek. It wasn't because she was afraid. It was because she had nothing left to prove there. Occasionally, news from the town would arrive through the mail. Beatrice Crow no longer appeared in public conversations. No one mentioned Clara as a moral lesson anymore. Millstone Creek goes on to live, like every other community, and Clara understood one thing very clearly. She didn't need that town to understand her in order to know who she was. One late autumn afternoon after class had ended, Clara stood alone in her room. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the wooden desks, which were already slightly scratched. She touched the blackboard where the childish letters still bore traces of chalk. She thought about the path she had traveled. It is not the path of one person being saved. It is the path of one person standing beside another, without being obscured. Samuel stood outside in the yard watching Clara from afar through the window. He didn't go in, he didn't call out. He knew that if he stepped in now, the meaning of that moment would change. And he didn't want to do that. Because between them, no one is the center. Only two people who choose to stand on the same side. Clara walked out of the classroom, closing the door behind her. She looked at Samuel. "You don't need to wait," she said. Samuel shrugged. "I'm not waiting," he replied. "I'm just standing here." She smiled very softly. No kisses, no lingering handshakes. Only the two of them stood side by side, gazing at the vast valley stretching before them. The wind blew through the dry grass, carrying the gentle sounds of nature. For older viewers, this was a moment that left them speechless, because they understand that true happiness isn't always about brilliance. Sometimes, it's simply about no longer having to bow down to wrongdoing. Clara Whitfield didn't reclaim her honor from Millstone Creek. She kept her honor for herself. Samuel Harlan didn't become a hero. He was simply someone who didn't remain silent when it was necessary to stand up. And that's enough. This story doesn't end with a promise. It ends with a choice. One that is repeated every day in very small things. Teach, work, have dinner together, be in the right place when needed. None of them are perfect. None of them are completely healed. But they found a way of life where vulnerability is no longer exploited, where honor is no longer something bestowed by others. And if there's one thing that should remain after all this, it's this. Honor is not something bestowed by others. It is preserved by those who dare to stand up when needed. Clara Whitfield stood up for herself. Samuel Harlan stood up at the right time. What remains is a life of continuity. Quiet, but strong enough that no one can push them away from themselves anymore. If this story leaves you with a familiar pause, then perhaps, somewhere in your life, you too have faced a choice to remain silent to keep the peace, or to stand up and uphold what is right. And perhaps you'll understand why sometimes it takes just one person to stand up and change the course of the world. From the story, "She's with child," they whispered until a cowboy stood up and said, "If she is, it's mine." What lingers longest is not the shocking plot, but a very real life lesson, especially for those who have lived through many years. The story reminds us that honor is not something bestowed by the crowd. It doesn't come from praise, nor is it lost because of rumors. Honor is preserved by how we live each day, by not doing wrong, even when silence would suffice, and by daring to stand up when others are treated unjustly. Samuel Harlan didn't become a hero because he was stronger than anyone else, but because he refused to repeat the silence that had caused him lifelong regret. The story is also for women like Clara Whitfield, women who lived righteously and decently yet were sometimes misunderstood. The lesson here isn't about waiting for someone to rescue you, but about not compromising yourself for peace. Clara didn't reclaim her honor through excuses, but by maintaining her career, her right to choose, and her standing tall in life. And for all of us, the story raises a very real question. When silence keeps us safe but hurts others, what do we choose? Thank you for listening and accompanying us through this story until the very end. If you feel a sense of yourself reflected in this story, please like, share, to spread kindness, and subscribe to the channel to continue listening to our slow-paced, humane stories, where kindness still has a place, even in the harshest times.